Good evening. My name is Gary Tintereau, Director of the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. A real pleasure to see so many of you here this evening in what I guess I can safely say is the second in what will become a series, we didn't plan it as such, of master classes focusing on an individual work of art or a series of works of art in the museum's collection. The first was organized by Amy Poster, focusing on a collection that we rediscovered of Annette Finnegan's Indian and Central Asian textiles that came to our museum in the 1930s, in the early 1930s. 6 or 7 years after we opened our door for the first time in a stub of a museum. It's not even the facade that we call the 1924 facade, because only the central section was built. The side wings were not yet there. We only had a few hundred works of art total in the collection. 5 or 6 European paintings. It was just the beginnings of an idea toward a museum. And Annette Finnegan, who's had spent much of her life collecting works of art, as you'll hear in a moment, in this enormous leap of faith in what Houston could be, gave her extraordinary collections, and they're extraordinary by any measure. Isabella Stewart Gardner, J.P. Morgan, and particularly being a woman operating in this era and going to the places that she did and buying the things that she did, attest to her extraordinary life and interests, and even to her philanthropy in finding a public place, a public repository for her collections so that they can be studied and enjoyed by future generations, as we have. And in that masterclass, we looked at wonderful Indian textiles. We weren't encouraged to touch them, but some of us did. And they were out of the cases, and they were much more accessible. And we had both scholars and collectors of textiles speak to us about the specificity of these Finnegan textiles. And it was Hiram Butler's, Hiram Butler, who was here this evening, attended that session, and had the idea of using that as a model to look at some of our Greek antiquities. And after a number of different trials and errors, we settled on this evening's program on the Houston painter and the vase that gave the name to the Houston painter, which is one of the great distinctions of our museum. Those of you who know our European art collections will know that we happen to have the Houston Strauss Sienese Madonna, the Houston Strauss Florentine Madonna. Art historians in the 20th century, when they could create a corpus of work made by an individual or a workshop, but not knowing the name of the author, would find another name so that we could understand and think about that creative intellect. So the Houston painter, as you'll hear shortly, is one of those, and a real point of distinction for our museum. Delighted to introduce our curator, assistant curator Chelsea Dacus, who assisted Francis Marzio many years in shepherding our collection and making the handsome displays that we have here in the Beck building. And as you'll probably hear from her, there are really 2 key individuals when it comes to, or you might say 3, all of them women, when it comes to the Museum of Fine Arts antiquity collections: Annette Finnegan, Isabel Brown Wilson, and Francis Marzio. And our displays as a result are of those 3 women, with a few additions, and we really are featuring them tonight. It was Hiram Butler's idea to invite Jasper Gaunt, who is a specialist in Greek vases or Greek vases, depending on whether you're a tomato or tomato person, to speak to us this evening about our special vase and our collection as a whole. And as you see, we have the special opportunity this evening to inspect some of these great and rare and wonderful and precious items outside of their latrines, making them much more accessible and available to us this evening. So thank you, Hiram, for this initiative and for making it all come to pass. Thank you, Dr. Gaunt, for coming down and joining us and speaking to us. And thank you, Chelsea, for all that you do for the museum. And you're up next.
Thank you, Gary, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you for this opportunity. I think this is a really exciting program. I would like to echo the thanks to Hiram. I think this is a really interesting opportunity to explore one of the great donors and people who really formed Houston as a cultural city. Before we get started, I'd like everyone to know that at the end of the program, I know many of you were looking at the vases earlier, but at the end of the program, we'd like to invite you to come up and get a good close look, ask any questions if you have any. We will have gloves that we can use to turn the vase around and show you anything that you might have a question about. Do please be careful not to bump the table. It's obvious, but this is an opportunity to really get up close and personal with these wonderful vases, which you don't find very often. That being said, I'd like to now introduce you to the remarkable woman who brought the vases you see here to the museum and formed the core of the antiquities collection. Annette Finnegan was a woman ahead of her time, with a singular vision and historic interests that helped form the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, as well as many other cultural institutions around town. She gave over 600 objects to the museum during the 1930s, 216 of which were to the antiquities collection. And today, those gifts represent about 35% of our antiquities collection, so a significant portion. Her gifts range in time from pre-dynastic Egypt in about 4400 BC to over 6,000 years ago, to Byzantine art in the 6th century AD. Born in 1873 in West Columbia, Texas, her family moved to Houston soon after for her father's hide business, which flourished in Houston and the new market city. She and her two sisters attended the newly established public schools here until 1888, when the family moved to New York, where the Finnegan Hide Company had an office. Her father seems to have been very interested in educating his daughters and may have made the move partly in order to ensure a better education for them. In the fall of 1888, Finnegan enrolled in Wellesley College in Massachusetts, one of the 7 sisters of women's colleges, where she became interested in art and women's suffrage. And that's one of the reasons I feel a particular connection to her, because I also went to a women's college, one of the 7 sisters, Mount Holyoke, which was founded by the same person who founded Wellesley, Mary Lyon. At Wellesley, she also became a member of the Wellesley Bicycle Club. And just as an aside, I wanted to make a note. At that time, women riding bikes was a symbol of the emancipated womanhood, and thus was somewhat scandalous and controversial because of the changes in clothing styles and societal roles that resulted from women riding bikes. So this is a woman very much ahead of her times. And in fact, cartoons of the era joked that women on bikes could hardly be distinguished from men. And this one, Lady Cyclist, have you seen a lady go by on a machine? Villager, well, I did see a party go past just now on a bicycle, but whether it was a young lady or only one of you young fellows, I wouldn't hardly like to say. So just to emphasize that point, she was a very unusual woman. And it's not surprising that Finnegan was a member of such a club. She was particularly independent and progressive. When she graduated in 1894, she moved back to New York, where she helped to run her father's business and was actually left in charge when her father traveled. From very early on, she was influential in the historic preservation of Houston. In 1896, when it was about to be torn down to make way for downtown expansion, she secured the preservation and sale of the family's home in Houston, now the Nichols Rice Cherry 1850 house in Sam Houston Park, because she believed in its historic and architectural value. The family moved back to a much grown Houston in 1903, where she and her sisters helped form the Houston Equal Suffrage League, the first women's suffrage organization in Texas since the statewide movement had ceased in 1896. She never married and took over the many profitable family businesses in 1909 when her father died, as he recognized in his will her superior business experience and tact. Her life changed in 1916 when she suffered a serious stroke and became physically weakened. She had been advocating for women's suffrage all over Texas, traveling despite the adversity that she faced and the sorts of people that just dismissed her opinions. But at this point, she had to step back from the running of her businesses and campaigning for suffrage. But she began traveling all over the world. The Museum of Fine Arts Houston opened in 1924, and by 1931, Finnegan had contacted the director, James Chilman, to see if she could acquire antiquities for the museum on her travels, setting up an ideal arrangement for the young museum over the next decade. She searched tirelessly for artworks of the kind needed and desired by the museum, purchased them, and gifted them to the MFAH in large shipments, kind of like Christmas on a pretty regular basis. These included fine Indian textiles and an outstanding collection of lace, but also very fine antiquities from ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome. Some of the first artworks she obtained were from a trip to Egypt in 1931 and included pieces like this very nice mummy mask from the 18th dynasty. There were also several shabtis, which constitute one of the strengths of the antiquities collection, like this very fine faience example. And these figures were buried with the deceased so that they could spring to life in the afterlife and serve the deceased. Other gifts in 1931 included abundant iridescent glass, like this flask. This iridescence, it now is such a valued part of the object, but it was actually created over time. It was not an intentional aspect of the object. It's now, originally the piece would have been a slightly bluish color, clear color. In 1934, she began to send over several Greek antiquities. Included in these treasures, she purchased this large geometric period Greek amphora, which likely depicts some of the activities that took place as part of the mourning process for the deceased. She also gave this Greek Corinthian inokoe, which is covered with beautiful examples of painted animals and possesses a rare lid. One of my favorite examples that was also given in 1934, and which you can see on the table, you can get a close look afterwards, is a kylix with a Maenad, a follower of Dionysus, grasping this writhing snake. You really get a sense of the wildness of this woman. And it may be that Miss Finnegan found that attractive herself with her unique personality. One of the greatest gifts to the Greek collection came in 1937, which included the Cycladic figure from about 2500 to 2000 BC. It's interesting, you see the Cycladic figure, that Finnegan noted that the Greek government claimed quite a few things that would have been included in the shipment. So these things, including this figure, must have been the ones that they allowed out of the country. So we can only fantasize about what they might have kept, right? Because not only did the shipment include the Cycladic figure, but also this wonderful funeral relief with two women and a baby. It's one of the few Greek marble pieces that we have. Our impressive myrtle wreath, which we're all very familiar with, came in that shipment, as well as some extraordinary pieces of gold Hellenistic jewelry. I've wanted to figure out a way to have these Cupid earrings made, because I definitely would wear those. Additionally, the 1937 shipment held several of the vases we have in the room with us tonight, like the pitcher in the shape of a head, of a female head. And this wonderful white ground lekithos, which I've just discovered, Jasper and I, have discovered together that this is not the Houston painter vase. In the original book where it was identified, the number is for this vase, 37.9, but the description is actually for that vase, which is at the very end, over there on the left. So that is actually the Houston painter vase. And that mistake has been carried for decades through all of our literature because of this one typo in the original book that identified the Houston painter. So now we'll need to make a note of that. But this vase and the other white ground vases, it's rare to have so many together. And they are wonderful examples of this type of tradition, and you'll be able to see and hear from Jasper what a really interesting, unique tradition it is. So that is a brief introduction. It doesn't include the many additional gifts that Miss Finnegan made of ancient coins or lace or her other philanthropic interests, which encompass the Houston Symphony and the public library. But this remarkable, independent, well-educated, brilliant woman was formative to the cultural life of Houston and to the collections of the Museum of Fine Arts. So now I would like to introduce Jasper Gaunt, a specialist on Greek ceramics. He worked with Dietrich von Bothmer, who was a curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, was at the time one of the leading specialists in ancient art. And Jasper is, I believe, leaving on a dig soon, later this summer. And he spent many years, who was for a time a curator at the Emory at the Michael C. Carlos Museum. And we are very lucky to have his knowledge here to share with us tonight. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Chelsea. And I'd like to join my thanks to echo others, to thank Hiram Butler for making this evening's event happen, and to Gary Tinterow for the invitation, and to Chelsea for much help in various ways over many years. So this evening I wanted to step back a little bit and try and imagine the sort of environment in which Annette Finnegan was operating when it came to acquiring antiquities for the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. We're talking about the early 1930s. That decade itself, a rather interesting one, the crash having happened just a few years before, things being very, very difficult financially in many, many ways. And here is a woman who is going out of her way to start trying to build up a collection. And the Houston painter name vase, which I have on the screen on the right, we'll look at that later on, arrived in a shipment in 1937. And I was very struck by the richness of this group of objects, as Chelsea says, this sending. It's like Christmas. And to be honest, I think that only one institution in this country can match the generosity of this particular sending, and that is the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston in the 1890s and the early 1900s, when Edward Perry Warren and John Marshall had an arrangement with the MFA in Boston that the MFA would send them a certain amount of money every year. They were living in England, and they should spend it however they chose on antiquities and then ship them to the museum in Boston. And this arrangement worked for about 20 years, and the results are spectacular. Anyone who has not been up to the MFA in Boston should jump on a plane at the first opportunity. It's magical. But in any case, in 1937, a series of crates, however many, arrived with at least 24 objects in them. And if one looks at it chronologically, it starts with this Cycladic figurine, which we see on this left screen. We've already seen it. So that's for the sort of Stone Age, 3rd millennium BC. And then there's a Mycenaean bronze sword from the late Bronze Age, and that joined a jar, Mycenaean jars she'd sent a couple of years beforehand. And then a super group of pieces of geometric Greek art. So on the left is a so-called horse Pyxis. And it's a particular rarity because there are only 3 horses. Usually there's 1 or 2 or 4. And these are containers for trinkets, jewelry, and that kind of thing. And the lids usually have pairs of holes pierced through, and you attach the lid to a pair of holes through the body so that you can orient it correctly. The horses are not just standing around there, a sort of shorthand for a chariot. And although I have only ridden a horse once in my life, I am told on good authority that having a chariot with 3 horses is extremely difficult because there's an imbalance in the way in which horses behave. It's okay to have 1, it's okay to have 2, it's okay to have 4, but 3 is really difficult. Anyway, it's a great rarity in pottery. There's one in the Kerameikos, and there may be 1 or 2 others, but almost none at all. And then the amphora on the right, we've either seen it or its mate. The scenes are of mourners attending a funeral, chariots processing underneath, mourners above. And then in the middle, a bronze geometric horse. The pottery certainly comes from Athens. The horse obviously had made its way to Athens, whether it was made in Athens, Attica, or whether it was made in the Peloponnese and made its way to Athens for market, who's to say. But this is material from the age of Homer, and it has a certain resonance about it. The Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, we don't any longer think that this is these are poems by one writer. Indeed, it's in a sense pre-literate, but these epics have been preserved for us because they were admired in antiquity, and they are still in print. You can go to any bookshop in the world, and it's available in 50-some languages, and there's a reason for that. And these are the material counterparts of those epics that are coming up, emerging. The term geometric arises for obvious reasons because most of the decoration on the vases is geometric in character. These swastikas and chevrons, diamond patching and so forth. The swastikas have absolutely no relationship to what was done with them in the 30s of the last century. It's simply a form of a meander added and turned around into a kind of pattern. They sometimes appear on shipwreck scenes in geometric jugs, and where they seem to symbolize danger, but perhaps no more than that. So in one shipment, here you have a case where you can tell the story of perhaps what remains the Greek civilization's greatest achievement, the birth of epic poetry. We'll come back to some pottery which is on the table here, and then moving into the late 4th century, we have this very, very pretty small grave relief with the deceased mother cradling a child, and the deceased mother seated here, and the nurse cradling the child. This is it's not a particularly grand version, it's not a particularly large version, but it has all of the great qualities that make Greek art so poignant: the directness, the introspection, and the realization that this is what's going to happen to all of us, and we should go and visit these monuments as family members and remember our loved ones that way. And then this spectacular gold wreath, one of the great glories of the collection. There are lots of gold wreaths from the ancient Greek world, some of them myrtle, but very few of them have flowers, and this is one of them. And in looking through the excellent website that you have been improving steadily over the years, I came across an image of this jar, and I thought, oh, what is this doing here? And it came also in 1937 with the wreath. It is of the same date as the wreath. It's a funerary piece. It's a hydria. It's got 3 handles, 2 lateral and 1 over here. It must have had some sort of a stand. It doesn't have an offset foot, and the reason it doesn't have a foot is why it hasn't been on display. But I was made to think immediately of this find from northern Greece, from the great Royal Macedonian burials of the late 4th century, a silver hydria in which the ashes of the deceased were placed, and then a gold wreath placed on the shoulder. And I wouldn't be in the slightest surprised if this gold wreath here hadn't originally been placed over that jar. There aren't so many of those. I don't know how one could test this scientifically, if one could at all, but in any case, it's a possibility. The number of options for these sorts of things in 1 year in the 30s is relatively small. So Annette Finnegan goes up to Wellesley, and what kind of experiences she has there besides getting on her bicycle? Well, it would beg a belief for us not to think that she became aware of what was going on in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. She must have gone in there from time to time, or at least heard about it, and the spectacular way in which those collections have been built up across the board. Not only antiquities, but even in, and I haven't really said much about the MFA in Boston because it seems so self-evident, but at Wellesley, there were women in particular involved in what would become a university museum after she had left. But perhaps one can imagine the groundwater, the conversations that start many years before the bricks and mortar are put together. The idea that perhaps it would be a good idea to have a museum, and perhaps it would be a good idea to have some ancient art. And Hannah Parker Kimball was a poet, and here is a first edition cover of one of her volumes of poetry. She had some Greek sculpture, including a particularly nice Polyclyton 5th century torso. It's a Roman copy of that. These two ended up at Wellesley before 1906. This is pretty early in the terms of collecting antiquities in this country outside Boston and outside the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And this would also continue in the 20s with gifts of some very modest pottery, but gifts nonetheless by a woman called Louise Waite, about whom I regret I know absolutely nothing beyond her name. Dr. Tinterow mentioned Isabella Stewart Gardner. She was a great patron of the arts, a great socialite, and there's a portrait by John Singer Sargent on the left. And here's a view of the courtyard at her home in Boston, and sprinkled in and about are pieces of Greek sculpture, Roman sculpture, decorative. There's even a sort of Egyptianizing falcon here. Some of these are very handsome works of art. She treated them as sort of Italian decorative sculpture from a villa or something like that, in a very different way from the one might think of a museum setting. But there they were coming in. These are things which are worth considering having in a civilized, cultivated environment, in a civilized, cosmopolitan city. Another woman, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if Annette Finnegan hadn't bumped into her on her bicycle. And then one goes a little bit down the road to Yale a decade later, and Rebecca Darlington Stoddard. She had married into an old New England family. There are 18th century portraits of some Stoddard judges at Yale. And she had the opportunity to give the university some money in order to buy a collection of about 400 Greek vases, of which 2 are on the screen. And the collection had belonged to a German archaeologist, Georg Lippold, who was a celebrated scholar of ancient sculpture, and it had been catalogued by a man called Paul Arndt, who worked in Berlin. And this collection suddenly became available, and she and her husband talked about this to the trustees and the director, and the funds were made available, and the entire collection came over. A remarkable achievement at the time. They came to Yale in 1913, and the catalogue was already out in 1914, still a standard work of reference. And almost all of the vases are still at Yale. Some of them are in storage, but many of them are on view. This one on the right by the Berlin painter with Athena, the goddess holding out a helmet. You have a Berlin painter, neck emperor with twisted handles upstairs, courtesy of Isabel Wilson and Francis Marzio. Then in the sort of wider context, women in the arts building things up, the Rhode Island School of Design, a remarkable institution founded in 1877, and in the early 20th century, the daughter of the founder, Eliza Green Metcalf Radke, took over, and she was instrumental in getting in attracting some of the first antiquities, or a few had come earlier through Warren and Marshall in the 20s. But this stele, so-called the Radke stele, a 4th century grave relief, shows the kind of environment in which antiquities were being purchased by various institutions, especially in New England. Outside of New England, the situation becomes more sort of regional, or rather sort of perhaps topical. Different cities begin trying to build up collections with agendas of civic pride. Chicago is a particularly famous one. Cleveland is another famous one. And then the Nelson Atkins in 1933. The museum had opened that magnificent neoclassical building, modeled, I gather, on the Cleveland Museum's footprint, but they made it just a little bit larger to remind the good people in Ohio where they belonged. These 3 pieces, just a selection of the super collections, very small but very nice, at the Nelson Atkins, from the early 1930s, pottery, silver, portraiture. And in a way, this is not only what was happening around in Annette Finnegan's life, it also represented the competition. So she was going to have to outperform and outbid and outcompete people who were seriously trying to bring important material to their towns. And one of the things which I am struck by is that she went all the way to Athens. She went to Greece in order to buy these things. And all of the people that I've been talking about otherwise, apart from the MFA, all of the Met, RISD, Yale, and all these other places, they were all buying from dealers in New York, particularly Jacob Hirsch and the Brummer brothers. And I wonder whether Finnegan reflected that actually, although it was difficult to get to Europe, that her dollars would go much, much further in Athens than they would on 57th Street. Anyway, moving away from sort of some of the background in which she collected on towards pottery and ultimately the Houston painter name vase, a few words just to set the context of Greek pottery in general. And basically speaking, Greek pottery comes in 3 types. There's the really plain, unglazed stuff. It's pottery plain and simple. Then there's pottery where it's glazed with black all over it. And then there's the figural material, which is the fine ware, the 2 fine wares and the coarse ware. All of them are interesting in different ways, and they have similar characters and dissimilar characters. How is this stuff produced? Well, the answer is it was produced in substantial quantities over a number of generations in different parts of Greece. And the sort of conditions in which it was made are very similar to ones in which one encounters in North Africa, in Tunisia, Morocco today. These are photographs taken by a Greek archaeologist working now in Oklahoma. And she went for a dissertation to Tunisia, and here you have a very humble one-story architectural setting, and here are the pots outside to dry, the damp pots that have sort of had accidents of one kind or another before they go into the kiln. There's a palm tree to give it a little bit of shade or whatnot. And then here are the pots slowly drying on their way to the kiln, and here they are after they come out of the kiln. Rows and rows and rows of them. And this is really very similar to the kind of environment that you have both in ancient and in modern Greece. The photograph here was taken in the 50s outside Athens. It's more or less where the airport is now. And what you have is a humble, low, modest architectural setting with some roof to provide some shade. There's a column holding up the roof here. All of this is open space in the background, so you can have some shade and let these things dry, not in the sun. Here you have some settling beds. The most important thing about Greek pottery and other potteries too is to remove impurities from the clay. These impurities take the form of quartzite crystals, and if they are included in the pot during the firing process, their coefficient of expansion is greater than the clay's, and so they will explode and they will pop off the outside layer of the clay and cause a nasty spall. So you have to purify it with water again and again. This is the first go around, and then it's cut up into blocks. And then there are these rings of clay discs ready to go off to the potter. And this is in the 1950s. If you look at this representation on the left of an Athenian pottery in the 5th century BC, time the Parthenon went up, here is a column exactly like this column, suggesting an architectural setting of a simple kind. And here's a whole bunch of people, 3 of them, engaged in, this one is painting a vase on the left. Here, he's got a paintbrush. This one is taking the vessel away from him and putting it on the ground, and it'll all go into the kiln. Remember this little group of vessels, of these things here? Well, we have a number of representations of potters at work from the ancient world, and they range from fairly small, modest establishments to much larger ones. These are 2. This one is made in Corinth, early 6th century, and you have a potter at work. Here is the wheel, a big, heavy, robust thing, so you can get it spinning to get a little bit of momentum, and it will help you to center the jug. In this case, he's making jugs. This one on his wheel, there's another one hanging up, another one hanging up here. And Rod, you have here a series of these discs that we saw in the 1950s pottery outside Athens. He's by himself, and then this one made a century later in Athens. This guy is involved in making cups. Here's his huge, great wheel, and he's actually attaching the second handle on a cup. And there's a series of other cups that he's just finished up on the shelf here. And here's his little doggy. He's come to keep him company. Rather touching. This is something made in Athens. It was found in Saqqara in Egypt. These things are exported far and wide. These are representations of potters making things on the wheel. There are also representations of painters. This is a lovely cup in the MFA in Boston. It shows a young boy, and he's got a cup in his hands. Here's the handle. Here's the bowl. There's the foot. And he's got a little stylus, so he's putting a decoration in a very delicate way over it. And that will then go to the kiln and be fired. This we've already seen. The boy with a paintbrush, that one will be finished, it'll be taken away, put on the ground, and then it will go into the kiln. These are sort of medium-sized operations. This one, it's a shoulder of a vase in Munich, has a number of people involved all at one time. Note the column here, the architectural space. This is a younger boy spinning the wheel while an older man lifts up through his fingers a huge storage jar, of which another one is seen here. This fellow here has been decorating a more fancy vessel. It's got an offset shoulder, offset mouth, all articulated with some forms of decoration, which the other ones lack. And over here you've got the kiln, a guy stoking it. There's some charcoal in here. They are often shown naked because it's hot outside. Whether you'd want to be that way in front of a kiln several hundred degrees is another matter. Anyway, we also have some lovely photographs, images rather, of kilns themselves being loaded up. This is a drawing on the left reconstructed from a fragment. There's a series of these plaques from a site in the Peloponnese, about 20 or 30 of them. They seem to have been dedicated in a sanctuary of Poseidon and Athena. Athena is certainly a patroness of arts and artists, and Poseidon may have been the other patron of the potters because of his association with earthquakes and therefore volcanoes and therefore fire. which is what you need in a kiln. So you load up your kiln. This is one is full of jugs. You can see one here. There's another one here. There's another one here. And you put them in higgledy-piggledy, and then you fill it up with charcoal, and you, as it were, strike a match. You have a red coal, and you start off the firing process. And the firing process is a very remarkable one, and it is in 3 parts. Greek clays are iron-rich, and you can get iron-rich. You can get iron to oxidize a red color, and you can get it to reduce a black color. And if you do it in 3 parts, first with oxygen, then without oxygen, and then with oxygen, you can get these marvelous black and orange, which is the colors of Attic clay at its best, and you'll see it on all of these vases here. So this is the first part of the kiln, where you can see red flames pouring out, and all of the clay in there will be turning bright red, whether it has slip on it or whether it doesn't have slip on it. And here it's smoking. That's been reduced. You've got green wood, leaves and whatnot, and it's smoking away. This guy's just climbing up the ladder and will look in to see what's going on. He may singe his eyebrows. Then it comes to selling these things. Here's an image of a young boy coming to a shop, and the shop is selling sympotic-ware vessels for the symposium. This is an amphora for containing wine, and it's exactly the sort of shape of this pointed one. It goes into a little stand here, and then these are skiffoi, so-called big drinking mugs, like this one in Princeton. He's got a little leather purse with a drawstring, and in here are some coins. So he's going to have, there's being a transaction, he's going to choose what he wants, or he's going to order something, and he'll take them home. These vessels, all of these vessels, the ones on the table, all of these pieces from Athens, from Corinth, from elsewhere, are made by potters and painters. And sometimes we know their names and sometimes we don't. This is one of the most famous of all Greek vases. It's in Florence. It was found outside Chiusi in Etruria. The Etruscans loved Greek pottery, imported lots of it, and we owe them a great deal for cherishing it and being buried with it. This is one of the most magnificent of all. It's a crater. It's made for mixing wine and water at the symposium. You'll be familiar with the idea that the Greeks diluted theirs a certain amount, and so you've got a huge volume of a body, and it's easy to put a hand in and draw off whatever you want. This is covered with mythology of all different kinds, and the frieze across the shoulder has the wedding of Peleus and Thetis. And this is like the royal wedding of last year in Windsor. It's like a Hollywood A-list celebrity wedding. Everybody wants to go, and so Peleus here is the bridegroom, and all of the gods. This is Dionysus, are lined up in chariots to come along to this particular wedding. He marries Thetis, and their child Achilles is the protagonist of the Iliad and the most famous of all Greek heroes. Every single figure on this vase is named and labeled, and the signatures of the potter and the painter are preserved. The name of the painter is right here, and the name of the potter is right there. Here it is Gotimos Epoiasen and Clytias Egrapsen. And these names are sort of sprinkled in among the names of the gods as if they too, the potter and the painter, are inviting themselves to this fantastic wedding. About these two individuals we know just a little bit more, because their partnership extended for several years. This is a famous little standlet in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, signed on one side Egotimos Epoiasen. Egotimos was the potter for this, and the other side, Clytias drew this. And what is this? It's about so high, for supporting perhaps a drinking cup. And like all the great masterpieces of Greek vase painting, the potter always respected the painter. And you can look at this as a piece of architecture where you can appreciate the moldings of the vessel, the mouth and the foot on the one hand, or you can appreciate the drawing. And the two are not in competition, they are in harmony, in synchrony. And that's why it's such a fabulous piece of pottery. Often, however, the Clytias and Agotimos, painter and potter, sometimes, however, only one person does it. He does the whole thing. And this is the case with a man called Niarchos. This is a fragment of a big drinking cup from the Athenian Acropolis. And here his signature, Niarchos me poiesen, Niarchos me graphsen. So he both pottered and painted it. And on the Naribalos in New York, his signature here, Niarchos Epoisen, he's the potter of it, and for stylistic reasons we can say that he painted it too. So there are two options. One is that the potter does the painting himself, and other times he hires a painter. Niarchos we know quite a lot about because he had two sons. One was a man called Cleson, and he signed a cup in the Met. The signature is right across here. He says, Cleson, the son of Niarchos, made this, and another son, Agoteles, the son of Niarchos, made this. So here you have direct evidence for a family-run business, the father having two sons, and the children will have had children themselves and passed it on through the generations. Niarchos also became quite wealthy. This pottery is high quality. It is used by people of substance and whatnot, and it's a profitable business. And towards the end of his life, 30 years after the pottery we're looking at, he's in a position to dedicate a huge statue, she's over 6 foot high, on the Athenian Acropolis. And here she is, you can see how large she is in relation to a visitor. Her eyes are inlaid with metal, bronze, and perhaps some silver, copper, some stone as well. And there's a base saying that Niarchos the potter dedicated this as a tithe, as 10% to Athena. And underneath it gives us the name of the sculptor, Antino, who also was responsible for some major sculptural pedimental work in Delphi on the Temple of Apollo, paid for by one of the most prominent families in Athens. So this shows how the kind of social milieu in which these people are working and operating. Now, the verb epoiesen, the word for a potter is keramus, and the dedication of Niarchos we just looked at talks about him as a potter, keramus. There's a very good verb, keramuo, which means I am a potter, I make pottery. None of the pots that have come down to us are signed as such. They're always signed with the verb poio, and this is the verb that is used by sculptors and by gem engravers and by other artists. Also, it's the word used of poets and poetry. It's a higher art form. It's more Apollonian. It's less sort of Panosic. It's less sort of, utilitarian. It's trying to raise things up just that little bit. And so this is a base, and it's actually signed by Praxiteles as the sculptor, and this magnificent gem in Boston signed by Dexamenos of Chios. People get very excited when they think that they've got original Greek sculpture, but the only original Greek sculpture from the 4th century where a named person is possible are on the sculpture bases, because the originals have long since been melted down or destroyed. So pottery in general, there are two big techniques, black figure and red figure. Black figures where the figures are black, red figures where the figures are red. This is a vase in Boston which is so-called bilingual, one side, one technique, one side on the other. Black figure, you apply a slip to the reserved background. So the orange is the natural color of the clay. That flower pot color is the natural color of the clay. And you put a slip, which is a thickened version of the same clay, on it. And that gives you black figure, and if you want red figure, you leave the orange to come out of the kiln, and you paint the background black. Black figure, you have two options. You have various options to make it more interesting. One is all these little sharp lines. Those are incised with a wire or something, a tip of something, and the color here. This cherry red and this white is laid over the top of the surface. And this is something which is borrowed, obviously, from metalwork. You can see these incised catch plate safety pins, fibulae, from the 8th century, sometimes with long flowing engravings, sometimes with stipple, just like you have here. And then in metalwork, you have inlays in silver and bronze on silver and copper on bronze, which give you something of the same polychromy you get in pottery. Red figure is a very different animal. It's a much more painterly one. You can make figures turn in space in a much more ready way. But one of the fun things about it is that because the background is what you paint over, the raw clay which you're decorating is left. And so this Skiphos drinking mug in London, you can see these wonderful preliminary sketch lines. They look like the lines that you make when you're trying to get a ballpoint pen to work. And this is the artist thinking out loud. These are the forelocks of the hair. And one of the tools that they have is this relief line, and you can see it here. It stands proud of the surface. And then you have this sort of 1/8 of an inch stripe that protects the figure. It's like going around a window frame or a door frame at home. You go around with a thin brush, do it rather carefully, and then you get out the roller for the background. And then the name vase of the Houston painter. And I was glad to be able to augment the size of the name vase. It's this one here, so one on the far end, not the smaller one in the middle. He is a man working in the middle of the 5th century, 550, 540, 450, 440, 430. And if you look at the figure, the draped figure here, with the drapery over the arm and leaving the side of the body, showing, it's very much like the boy handing over the peplos in the most sacred part of the East frieze of the Parthenon, done 10, 20 years later. This is a white ground likithos. It's a funerary vessel. It shows two figures at a grave monument, which is over here. One figure is here. The second figure is here. We'll see it more easily on the table. They are used for grave relief. They are the subject matter of these comes to be purely funerary. The visit to the grave, and there are representations of these things as grave offerings, and you can either leave them outside the grave. The grave will have looked something like this. These are modern plaster casts, concrete casts of ancient originals, which are now in a museum, and they've been put out in the Kerameikos, the old cemetery of Athens, and in the family grave plots. And you can see that these things are set up on steps here. And there's a representation of one right here in New York. The shaft comes down a couple of steps. These are details of them. And on these steps are little vessels which the family and friends have come to give as tribute and memory. A couple of them have fallen over. It's so touching. It's so like life. So these white ground likithoi can either have been left like that, or because they've been preserved in this way, they must have been consigned to graves themselves. Towards the end of the 5th century, they become quite large. This one on the right in Berlin is sort of 2.5, 3 feet high. And at this point, they start having false interiors. Old Dad may have passed away, but we don't need to fill up the whole vessel with expensive, perfumed oil. We'll just make a false interior, and no one will know the difference. And it might be fun with the Houston painter name vase just to stick a little kebab stick into the top of it to see whether it's got a false interior or not. And these, as time goes on, they get bigger. They also come to resemble very much a class of funerary antiquity in its own right, marble likithoi, like this one. There's a whole series of them, and in this particular one, it's decorated with a grave scene, whose iconography is taken straight off, the kind of thing that you get on flat reliefs like the one that you have here. White ground itself is a luxury reference, and it alludes to a production of vessels in marble. In particular, there's a white ground in pottery occurs only on a fairly limited, restricted range of shapes, all of which have marble counterparts. This is a photograph of a whole case of these things found in Delos, or just outside on an island near Delos, there in Mykonos, and you can see these little alabastra, just like this white ground one here. All of those marble vessels were made in Athens, and so was the white ground pottery. And you see it for alabastra, you see it for likithoi. This one on the left is from northern Greece. This one, very spectral, I'm afraid, in an old photograph of mine, on Mykonos now, and this is the white ground version of it. There are 5 on the table. Pyxis also, you have white ground one in New York, Judgment of Paris, Hermes, the gods and goddesses coming around the other side, and this is the versions in marble. Some of these are the most gorgeous works of art in their own right. They're translucent, they're so finely worked. Fialae, libation bowls, the ones on the left here and here, this one in Amsterdam, this one in Mykonos, and here's one in Boston. So the white ground it accesses an idea of something luxurious, and that goes back to it's an Athenian imitation of a practice from Asia Minor of the previous century. These are 2 fully preserved pieces, one from the great royal burials at Ushak and one from the treasury in Persepolis. And they're in this white jasper with yellow and red mottling over them. And this is a royal tableware. You think that you're rich if you have silver and gold, but you're a pauper if you don't have this kind of stuff. And we know from inscriptions that this was fabulously expensive, and that's why the white ground imitating marble is so successful. Now, Annette Finnegan sent a number of pieces in 1937 back, and 2 of them are on the table. One of them is the name by the Houston painter, and another is by a man we know as the Saburov painter, after a collector in Berlin of the late 19th century. And this is of some interest because at the same time as she was buying, one particular grave was found in Athens, and it had 3 likithoi in it, white ground, and they were bought by a man called the Freiherr von Schön, who gave them to Munich in the 1960s, and they were published by Bouchot 10 years before Finnegan started to acquire things. The grave of an Athenian maiden, he called it. It was a girl, there was some jewelry. And 2 of these likithoi are this one is by the Houston painter, and this one by the Saburov painter. And the third one is the most famous of all white ground likithoi ever found. And it's the one, all of these 3 are now in Munich. And this one is not a funerary one, it's a from everyday, ethereal everyday life. This is Apollo and his raven here, and this is the hill. Behind the seated figure is an inscription, Helicon, the sacred hill for the muses. So here is Apollo and one of his muses seated on and playing her lyre. It's recently been thought that she might be Sappho. But how nice to think that perhaps a second grave with things very, very similar grouping has been preserved here at the MFA in Houston. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I went on a bit too long, but I think that I'm happy to take questions, but otherwise I think that the much more interesting thing is for everyone to have the opportunity to come and look at the objects themselves. Yeah?
Jasper, before we go into those specifics of our works, I just wondered if you could help us think about the utility of corrupted ceramics.
Yes.
And also the ubiquity. So just thinking in terms of contemporary life or modern world the last few hundred years, if you go go to a Central American village, you will find either glazed or unglazed pottery, but especially the unglazed pottery, just stacks and stacks of little dishes or cups or things like that are essentially like disposable plasticware. They're produced in great quantity. They can be beautiful, but they were almost disposable items of utility. And then they can be decorated, and sometimes we'll buy them and bring them home and use them for as long as they last. Then on the other sort of spectrum, you have, let's say, British Wedgwood, which imitates Greek pottery, which can only be bought by affluent people or the nobility or the gentry, and are used with great care and are passed down from generation to generation. Then there's silver plate and, as you say, marble vessels. So where does the Greek pots that we collect and admire in Western museums, where does it fit on those scales?
Well, that's a wonderful question. Thank you. Pottery is not intrinsically expensive, and it's not expensive because it's made of clay. If you want some clay in Greece, you go out into a river valley and you dig it up and you have at it. So the cost, the net cost of, or the gross cost of producing pottery is very, very small. And it comes down to the Greek, in 5th century Athens, the labor is a drachma a day for pay. And you can get a vase for less than a drachma. But if you think then of a pottery producing all this stuff, you don't just make one vase and fire it. You're making hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, and you fire them in batches. So these things are not everybody has them, but they have quite a wide usufruct. They are made. What we've been looking at is made in Athens, mostly from the 6th, 5th, and 4th centuries. Much of it stays in Athens, but huge quantities go off to Italy, to Etruria. Some of it has been found in the south of France, has been found in southern Germany, in Switzerland, up the Croatian coast. It's found in Spain, all around the Black Sea littoral. It's been found in Egypt. It's been found in the heart of Achaemenid Persia, in the palace at Persepolis, palace at Susa. It has an enormous geographical spread, and it spreads because, like Wedgwood and like Chinese export porcelain, it was admired. It was beautiful stuff, and if you didn't have pottery of this kind, nobody else was making it like that. You could have wooden platters, you could have silver platters, you could have bronze platters, but if you wanted pottery, which had a sort of luster and a shine to it, and on which you could find mythological stories which were engaging, that was the way to go, and you had to go to Athens because essentially nobody else was up to making this kind of stuff. All Greek pottery was used or made for use, and they tend to fall into kind of areas of use. There's a small vessels for perfume, for unguents, often used for women, also for men. These are small, and they have kind of narrow mouths and wide rims so that you can smear the stuff out. That's one group. Then there's the sympathetic material, so that's drinking cups, like the one on the table, the plate. And then there are funerary ones like the white ground lekythoi. And when we have archaeological contexts, we often find that a burial will be made up of two groups of pottery, clearly so on stylistic grounds, one 30 years earlier than another, and we infer that the parents bought the first lot, the children bought the second lot, and maybe it was all buried with the grandchildren when it didn't matter so much, or didn't have so much personal attachment. Does that? Oh, come and look at it. This is the most wonderful. It's heavenly material.